All right, good afternoon, everyone. I see some people coming in. We'd love everyone to come on up to the front so we can be nice and comfortable and cozy in this large cavernous space. We want to have a comfortable conversation today, so please come to the front as you're entering. Great. So good afternoon. I'm Tara Sullivan. I'm the Director of Technical Programs at the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, and I'm the moderator for today's session. I am delighted to welcome you to this candid conversation, From Missteps to Momentum, What Family Planning Failures Teach Us. So at conferences, we typically celebrate our achievements, but today we're doing something different. We're here to talk about failure. Not to blame and shame, but as one of our greatest teachers. Too often, lessons from missteps are not shared because of the stigma associated with failure. The result? The same missteps are repeated, and lessons are not learned. We want this to be a supportive space to share and learn from each other. Before we dive into the session, I'd like to introduce our wonderful and courageous panelists who are joining us today. First, I have Alessandra Areju, who is the Director of Health and Protection Division at Humanity and Inclusion, joining us from Brussels. Next, I have Jan Lacayo. He is the Family Planning Advisor and Technical Global Lead at UNFPA, joining us from Nairobi. Next, we have Bisrat Desering, who is an emerging global health leader, researcher, and SRHR and social inclusion advocate, joining us from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Next, we have Abak Barnabas, who joins us from Nairobi, Kenya, and is the Deputy Director of Programs at IPPF on the Women's Integrated Sexual Health Phase 2 project. And finally, we have Taiwo Johnson, who is the Project Director for the Challenge Initiative Nigeria for the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, and she's joining us from Abuja. Now, we'd like to know a bit about you and your experience and perceptions with failure. So please take a moment, grab your phones, scan the QR code on the screen. This will take you to a series of questions that we will ask. Your answers will project on the screen behind me, and you'll also be able to see them on your phones. So you can either scan the QR code or you can go to the URL and punch in the code. Okay, first question. Are we ready? Thumbs up if you got it sorted. Thumbs up, awesome. Have you ever been part of a work activity that didn't go as planned? Okay, we have resounding yeses, not a single no in the audience. I think all of us can relate to this. I mean, as best we try, best laid plans, we always wind up either misstepping in some way, and we learn from those. So our next question, what is one word you think of when you hear the word failure? Oh, looks like we still have the same. Oh, there we go. Accountability, bad. These are great. I can see that the one that is in big bold is bad, and I think that's something that comes to mind when you think of failure. You think it's bad, you think that there's some accountability if you've failed, there's going to be a price to pay. Obviously, there's disappointment because things didn't go as planned. A lot of times there's shame associated with that. Of course, we don't want to repeat it. It's very stressful. All of the things that you've mentioned, we lose time, etc. Okay, on to the last and final question. Why do you think it's important to share our failures? Okay, so the big theme coming up here is that we want to learn from them, which is absolutely true, and that's sort of the spirit of today's session. So thank you all so much for sharing and letting us know how you're showing up to this space today. So now I want to take a moment and talk about failure. Wait for the slide to come up. All right, I'll just keep going. So at the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, we believe in the power of communication, not just to inform, but to connect, reflect, and grow. We're committed to fostering meaningful collaboration where knowledge flows freely and strengthens family planning and reproductive health programs. Why does this matter? Because when people share what they know, including missteps, programs thrive. They avoid costly mistakes, reach their full potential, and serve the FPRH community more effectively. It's that spirit of learning and collective growth that brings us here today. First, we aim to foster a culture of openness that encourages sharing experiences, insights, and lessons learned. And second, we want to normalize sharing failures and embrace setbacks as powerful learning opportunities that help us grow, improve our work, and better serve the communities where we work. So in our conversations with FPRH professionals, we've repeatedly heard that people want to know what works, but also what doesn't. Yet talking about what doesn't work or failures can be hard, and failures come in many forms. We can think of failures of existing on a spectrum. On the one hand, we may have what can be called predictable failures. So as an example, scheduling an event on a major holiday which negatively affects attendance. This is preventable and it's also avoidable. On the other hand, we have what we could call unpredictable failures. They're things we couldn't necessarily have anticipated. These failures sort of happen at what you might call the frontier. There's no clear roadmap, and it's where testing a new health intervention or trying a creative approach to community engagement, where failure may happen, but it provides data, and it helps us learn what works in this uncharted territory, and we can apply that to our future programs. The key is to learn from all types of failure. By discussing what works and what doesn't, we can turn today's unpredictable challenges into tomorrow's predictable and avoidable ones. So what have we learned? At CCP, we've been exploring how to motivate people to share their failures using a behavioral economics lens. In partnership with the IBP Network, we have hosted virtual FailFests where participants have bravely shared their experiences with failure. These events, along with our research, have revealed some powerful insights. So perhaps not unsurprisingly, language matters. The words we use to describe failure can either encourage or discourage sharing. Using gain framing, or language that presents failure as an opportunity for growth, improvement, or progress, can motivate people to share failure. For example, pairing a positive term like improving or learning with the word failure helps to destigmatize the concept. Another thing that we've learned is environment is key. So people feel most comfortable sharing amongst peers in a safe and trusted environment. And finally, we've learned that sharing builds connection. When people open up about their failures, they're often surprised to discover how much in common they have with others, whether it's even across topic areas or country contexts. The shared experience fosters empathy and helps people feel more supported, knowing others have faced similar obstacles. So now that we've explored why sharing matters and how it can lead to growth, let's talk about how we will approach this conversation today. As part of our session, we'll use curious questions to facilitate discussions around failure. This approach comes from the NGO Fail Forward, and it's grounded in the idea that curiosity is what drives discussion around failure. They are meant to help people sharing feel better understand their failure, learn from it, and incorporate the learning into future work. They're not about problem solving, they're not discussing what the person should have done differently, they're not blaming and shaming. It's really that curiosity piece. So as we go through the panel today, you'll hear me ask a series of curious questions after the panelists share their stories to dive deeper into their failure experiences and reflect on what they've learned. So, now that we have set the stage for why failure matters and how we will approach it today, it's time to hear from our panelists. Each of them has generously agreed to share a personal story of failure, moments that challenged them, taught them, and ultimately helped shape their work. As you listen to the stories, I invite you to reflect on what you've experienced and if you've experienced something similar in your work and what you've learned from that experience. Okay, with that, let's begin. So to start us off, we'll hear from my colleague Taiwo. Over to you, Taiwo.
Okay, so as the project director for the Challenge Initiative in Nigeria, we work with states. And what we do is we work with them for 3.5 years, and then we graduate them. And graduation means that they would have attained a certain amount of ability to sustain high impact interventions, such as mobile outreaches and postpartum primary planning. And so we work with them within these 3 years, and then we graduate them. And we did that in Nigeria at in the initial phase of the Challenge Initiative. We worked with 11 states, and so we graduated them. And what did we learn? Years later, about a year and a half later, we had a meeting with them, with our stakeholders, mostly pause and reflect sessions and stakeholders engagement. And we learned that one of the things that we did, the feedback we got from them was we left them. TCI left us, you just left us, you didn't look back, and then things started dropping. And working with them, when we graduated them, one of the things we had in mind with, great, we have graduated you, which means sustainability is ensured, you are able to stand on your own, but it doesn't always work like that. And you know, in Nigeria, in my context, when you graduate, you don't go back, right? We go back means that you're repeating the class. And so you forge ahead. And so for us, we just assumed that we had done everything we need to do, and then the state was ready to stand alone. But we were wrong. And so what did we learn? One of the things we learned was we left the states, as I said, the stakeholders spoke about it. And so we went back to course correct. And what we did was we started having meetings with them to learn what was going wrong. Because what we noticed was after we left, when we started looking at their data, their indices were going down, family planning indices, and stakeholders coordination meeting wasn't as regular. And so, one of the things we also learned was sustainability doesn't always mean we stop. It means we continue. We also learned that exit shouldn't be transitions, but they should be graduation. There should be graduations. And I mean, exit shouldn't be graduation, but should be transition. So what I mean is we needed to have transitioned them and not to graduate them. And so going forward, we now developed a post-transition framework. And in that post-transition framework, we started supporting them, regular coaching. We trained coaches to continue providing supervision and training and building their capacity. We also started having quarterly touchpoint basis with our stakeholders. And lastly, we also had pause and reflect sessions. We always looked at their data and we followed up. And one other critical thing we did was we had an exchange learning where they could learn, the states that had graduated could also learn from the states that were still very active. And so there was like a peer-to-peer learning. And what did this do? We know there was an improvement. There was an improvement in their indices, there was improvement in their data. And so one of the things we learned was transition is a journey. You don't just leave and leave, you don't just graduate and leave, but you always transition the states and continue to support them until they reach that particular milestone that you want them to achieve.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Taiwo, for so openly sharing your story with us. And I love what you said at the end, that transition is just, ongoing. And I think that was an important part of the lesson that you learned, that graduation is a word that maybe you use, but transition and having that transition plan is the support you need for sustainability. Thank you so much. So with that, I will turn to Abak to share his story.
Thank you. So in the first phase of the WISH project, I served as a head of region or a regional manager. And my role entailed supporting a portfolio of countries, 6 countries to be specific. And this being a payment by results project, we definitely had KPIs that we needed to meet in order to get paid. And so there was a lot at stake. Like any program manager, for you to succeed, the biggest task is usually translating the concepts in the proposals or in the technical write-ups into action. So we spent 6 months program inception, working with the country programs to translate the ideas we had in the proposal into action and setting up their teams and putting all the processes in place. And of course, we did expect that we would start seeing results from the first quarter of implementation. Now, at the end of the first quarter of implementation, surprise came in when during the quarterly review, one of the countries that I supported, that we had anticipated to reach about 4,000 CYPs in a quarter, only reported 18 CYPs. Now imagine how difficult that would be in a quarterly review meeting with the project leadership on a payment by results program. I still remember our program director posing a question to me during the quarterly review and asking, Abok, how do you like South Sudanese food? And I asked, oh, why do you ask? And she said, I think you're going to spend so much time in South Sudan. I did take that as a challenge and did plan a visit to South Sudan for 2 weeks, to be specific. And I brought along with me a few of my colleagues, and we started from scratch. We had working sessions with our implementing partner, going back to the basics around what our technical approach is, what we want to deliver, how we want to deliver it, what teams we need to put in place, etc. And by the end of the 2 weeks, we had come up with an acceleration plan that then we started implementing and following through. And beginning that quarter, we started reporting results to the expectation, and up to the end of the project, we successfully delivered our results in that country. Now, this failure for me was quite important because one, while I was working with a portfolio of countries that had different contexts, I had initially faced it as though if we had a similar standard or a similar process for every country, we would succeed. But then I realized there were different context-specific issues that I needed to have paid attention to for us to succeed in this particular country. And so I've taken this lesson from the first phase of the project, and now as the Deputy Director of Programs in Wish2, we did have recently an inception phase, and some of my team members who are in the room will tell you that learning from this experience, I've learned that there is need to pay a little more detail, especially during the inception, and don't assume that the partners I am supporting actually understand what we want to do and how we want to do it the same way I understand it. And so it's a lesson that has actually helped me go and continue my work even today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abak, for sharing your story and reflecting on your experience. I love how you shared how when you learned of the KPI that wasn't to your satisfaction, how you went back to basics and how you've learned from that experience about how context matters and how you're moving that forward as you're achieving scale up and sustainability today. Thank you so much. Okay, next up, we'll hear from Bisrat.
Okay. So the story that I will be sharing is a story when I was working in Ethiopia. And I was working as a researcher, and it was a job of evaluating a JEDC inclusive work or like a development program that was in the Somali region of Ethiopia. And so to evaluate the JEDC inclusion of like the development program, that was working to increase access to healthcare for internally displaced people in the Somali region, and the evaluation was to see how that increased like access to healthcare, especially sexual reproductive health and rights, and how that integrates into economic empowerment since they are IDPs. So I designed a mixed methods research approach, and there was a survey, and there was like FGDs and KIIs. And as part of the FGDs, we included like different populations like male, female, like people with disabilities, young women with disabilities, and so forth. So we were very excited as part of the team, and I was leading that. And we trained the enumerators about the basics of research, how to collect the data, how to do the survey, and all of that. And we were very excited to see the results of like the best practices that I could share, like the reports that I was going to write. And so I was having like debriefing sessions with the enumerators like daily and weekly. And once they did the FGDs with women with disabilities, which I did not expect, and I was caught off guard, is they came back to me and said, "Why are you making me do this research?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" Because they are local enumerators, mind you, and they are closely working with people with disabilities, and they are marginalized groups, and there's a lot of problems happening. And I was like, why did this happen? And they said the women were crying. They were crying and saying like, "Why are you asking me these questions when you clearly see what's happening with me? How can you ask me if I can access like healthcare, if I do have economic empowerment, like would I still be here?" And they were really traumatized and distressed, the women, and the enumerators came to me and the questions are really wrong, and this should stop, and that it's not gonna generate any good data. So I saw one of the reflections that people were doing was panic, and I panicked, of course, but I realized it's not too late. So we stopped the data collection. I designed again a training for the enumerators. What I did was we sat down with the enumerators, we revised the tool, especially the FGD questions, and made sure our language was inclusive and we are being as intentional as possible to understand the people's perspective and experiences. And the other was I really trained the enumerators in terms of trauma-informed research and how to engage with those sensitive topics. And that really helped because after that engagement, they were able to generate real good data, and we were able to report good failures for the program as well, because that also shows the program really failed somehow, and that really made me sit with, it's good to know about failures, and that it's really important to see the failures as well. So what I really learned is that never to assume that enumerators or anybody that you're working with is at the same level of you of understanding how to handle sensitive topics, and whenever designing a research or a program, always to prioritize people at first, because whatever you're doing, the research or the program, the first beneficiary or the people that are prioritized are the people in the communities. So if it is going to be posing risk, it doesn't matter. And it really made me think about these two whenever I do research, because I'm in the academia space and I do engage with a lot of research. And I brought this experience with me along the way whenever I do research.
Wonderful. Thank you for that brave and honest reflection, Basrat. What stands out to me is the leadership that you brought to that. When you learned there was a problem with data collection, you paused, you re-looked at what you were doing, you redesigned the process, and clearly you've learned and are carrying that forward. So thank you so much for that. Okay, so now that we have heard these thoughtful and powerful stories, we're going to take a pause and we're going to ask each of these first panelists some curious questions so we can dive in a little bit deeper. So starting with you, Taiwo, what makes the failure that you shared meaningful to you personally?
This particular failure was meaningful because it made me sit down and reflect why the states would think that we abandoned them. And when I did that, it got me thinking, as I mentioned earlier, in Nigeria, when you graduate, we don't look back. But we didn't actually graduate the States because we were still supporting them. And like, it got me thinking that, we needed to change this nomenclature and move away from graduation. And so we did. And so in the next phase of, next set of states that we work with, and once we were graduating them, we changed that nomenclature. We didn't graduate them, we transitioned them. And that terminology worked magic for us. So for me, that was a personal reflection that just nomenclature is a game changer. I mean, it can change the narrative and it can change people's perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, next one for Abad. Why is the story that you shared the one that you chose for today's panel?
So this particular story then helped me value good leadership, or supportive leadership. At the point I was making this presentation, my leadership didn't frown at me or didn't tell me how much I had failed. Instead, they pointed me in the right direction and asked, how do you want to sort this out? And I have gone on to appreciate that when working with a team, it is important to be supportive and recognize that failures do happen, and it doesn't matter the magnitude of the failure or how much you failed. What matters is how supportive you create the environment to correct that failure. Two, in family planning programming, the rights of the beneficiaries or the clients is quite important. And many a times when we set projections of what we want to achieve, sometimes we may be tempted to push too far or too hard to achieve these projections. And that puts us at a risk of compromising the quality and voluntarism that we all seek to give to our clients. And so, even amidst the failure, I never ever thought that I should do something out of the ordinary to correct this. I still believed that I can correct this while still maintaining voluntarism and ensuring that the clients get good quality. And lastly, program inceptions are usually quite critical for projects. And it is at that point that you actually make or break, you lay the foundation for the success. And I take a lot of lessons from this failure in the sense that I do now pay a lot of attention in program inceptions, just looking at, do we have the right teams? Do we have the right plans? Are we putting our resources where they should be? Are the activities we are planning going to give us the results we want to get, etc.? And so that has helped me in my career as I went along in program management. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Abak. And I really love the reflection you shared on the importance of both supportive leadership and then thinking about the balance of achieving your goals while thinking about clients' rights and always keeping them front and center. And then finally, your point about inceptions and their importance in laying the foundations. So thank you to our first three panelists. We really appreciate you sharing your story. And now we're going to move on to our second round of stories. So our first speaker for the second round is Jan Lacayo. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. When I received the invitation, I struggled a lot on choosing my personal story because I failed a lot in my life. It was a really hard task of choosing between all the things, and every day you fail, and you learn from that. So, I think my story is one of the biggest or failures in my life probably lasted over 25 years or so, and I'm still trying to learn from that. When you're a kid, you go to your dad and ask like, Dad, can I have a second ice cream? I said, well, ask your mom, and then you go to your mom and says, oh, ask your dad. Until you realize there's a shortcut, and you go to your grandma. She usually say yes. So, from there, and for the next 25 years, I was pretty much doing the same, repeating the same pattern, but without realizing, there was a grandma. And I started advocating a lot for, I really love failing, so I chose the most difficult topic, abortion, and the most difficult place, Central America, to advocate for. I miserably fail many times. And then I moved to family planning, and mainly on sustainable financing. I started working on domestic resource mobilization, and building evidence around the value of investing in family planning, cost-benefit analysis, investment cases, and return of investment in family planning. I spent a lot of time preaching among the convinced, and I lost my time. Let me be very frank and honest. I lost a lot of my time because I didn't understand that, in this context and in certain areas, particularly domestic resource mobilization, you can go to the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health can say, yes, we have the will to invest in family planning, this and that, and you're happy, you celebrate and say, oh, there's a budget line now for family planning, right? But then when it comes to the expenditure of that budget line, you realize that that guy that was, the guy that approved the checks wasn't really, willing to do that. And it never materialized. So just wonder what happened. What did I do wrong? I was a failure. And very recently, after 25 years of doing the same, repeating the same story, sometimes succeeding, I'll be honest, a couple occasions, I realized that I was not advocating effectively. I was probably communicating. I was being an activist. I was trying to do some behavior change, but I didn't understand what advocacy is, effective advocacy, especially when it doesn't come with, an action from the people you're advocating to, and that concrete action, move things forward. Then it's just, preaching the air. So I learned about smart advocacy, which is a methodology that helps you to go through 9 steps and identify very smart objectives. And that helped me to understand, okay, maybe if we break down this very complex thing, I can, get to my objectives. In the UN, is a very risk-averse organization or set of organizations. And it's really hard for us, to think out of the box and challenge the status quo, and literally, prove new things, be innovative, because it comes with, failure comes with a big price tag, which is, I work for a $2 billion project, a program that was initiated in 2007. A small failure has a huge implication. So you need to be very careful, but at the same time, you need to be challenging with yourself first. Try to see, oh, do I know it all? Can I learn from other people that have been doing this? This is the case we have in Africa, A lot of lessons learned from Africa, Asia Pacific and Latin America. We aren't looking at that, We're failing into looking into that wealth of experience and lessons learned. So yeah, my biggest failure has been, having the wrong idea of how to advocate, how to make that advocacy link to concrete actions and catalyze results.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. It's a great story and it's a powerful story, and I love how you were able to kind of reflect and learn as you were going over, I think you were saying 25 some years to arrive at the SMART advocacy technique. And also, I like your point that drives home how it can be very hard to admit a failure, the high stakes that are involved, especially in a $2 million environment that you're talking about, but you turned it around. So thank you so much for sharing that. Our next story, we have Alessandra, so I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. As a specialist on inclusive sexual and reproductive health and rights, I had the privilege and the honor to really be a pioneer in advocating for sexual and reproductive health and rights for persons with disabilities and with persons with disabilities. But of course, I also saw many challenges, and not always early enough to address those challenges timely. So the story that I bring to you today, it's really the story of a project on inclusive sexual and reproductive health and rights in those early days when addressing and promoting the right of persons with disabilities, and especially women and girls, was not as obvious as today. Today we had, at the plenary session, 4 or 5 speakers advocating for persons with disabilities being included in SRHR. Many years ago, I was often the only in the room raising my hands and ask for disability inclusion to be considered. Of course, that means that there was a learning process throughout the years for people like me and for the project that I looked after. And so what I'm sharing with you today is really a learning journey that at the center has the key principle of how to promote meaningful participation of persons with disabilities and their representative organization. So the aim of the project that I'm bringing to you today, it's really one of the first multi-year project on inclusive sexual and reproductive health and rights that aim to really increase access to sexual and reproductive health information and services for marginalized populations, including, and first of all, women and girls with disabilities. And this was important because as some of you may know, persons with disabilities still face multiple barriers when it comes to accessing health information and services, and certainly sexual and reproductive health and rights information and services. This is because often there is a lack of awareness also of their own rights, but not only among persons with disabilities because of lack of information and access to information, but very much also among the communities, within the communities where they live. And so this journey brought us to organize and develop projects that had organization of persons with disabilities at the center, and had one of the objectives was to raise awareness about sexual and reproductive health and rights within the group of persons with disabilities and in their communities. Really, as I said, that the key was not only the meaningful participation as a principle, but also the meaningful capacity building of persons with disabilities in their organization to ensure that they could really be a part of the full project. And so we had the opportunity to work with, and I had the opportunity to work directly with colleagues from these organizations to design and implement projects with them. Of course, these organizations and the representative had very different profiles. Some of them were journalists or communication specialists, but didn't have any background on sexual and reproductive health and rights. Some others were a little bit more familiar with sexual and reproductive health and rights. What we did to make sure that everybody was starting from the same base, we creating training and coaching for persons with disabilities that were implementing the project on the ground. And it looked that it went very well until we had the middle year workshop with them. And while everybody was very excited, and when I asked, how did it work? Well, the answer that we didn't expect, and I didn't expect, is that many people shared their challenges in communication. So we invested so much in training and coaching our colleagues on sexual and reproductive health and rights that we totally underestimated the other challenges that they were facing. And so we didn't prioritize, for example, any capacity building on communication, also because the funds that we had available did not allow us to make any other training apart from sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we realized there was a big step missing, and so I designed, I tried to recuperate really the situation for the second half of the year, and we created training on communication skills for our colleagues. And in the second half of the year, everybody felt more comfortable, and this really boosted the confidence, the self-confidence of our colleagues, and also the ownership of the activities. Really, this brought a huge added value to the project. But what we realized is that missing that very fundamental step really was really putting the project at risk, because we cannot have a project without meaningful participation, but without the full capacity of the colleagues, we cannot have meaningful participation. And so we learned a lot from that. And I, as I was on the front line, will never forget that experience. And I will maybe spend a couple of minutes later to tell you what happened next after that experience.
I'm sure we'll all love to learn what happened next after that experience. But thank you so much for sharing that thoughtful story, and how sometimes in our programming you're focusing on one item over here, but it's really the other thing over here, which in your case was the communication that wasn't funded, that needed some attention. So thank you both for sharing your stories. And now, of course, I'd like to ask each of you a curious question. So Jan, what makes the story that you shared important to share with others? It's a two-part question. And the second part is, how do you hope people benefit from your experience?
Right. Yeah, I think like probably most of us, if not all of us, are quite engaged in advocacy in one way or the other. And we spend a lot of money on that. Honestly, I think like half of my job is pretty much advocacy. Although I don't have that title. And I just realized I was doing it all wrong. And, you know, I think by sharing this experience would probably generate that self-questioning mode on yourselves, like, am I doing advocacy right? And perhaps you had that, curiosity of learning, like, how do I effectively do advocacy? How can I reach the grandma, the decision maker behind whatever you're doing? In my case was domestic crisis mobilization, but it happens in policy, in gender-based violence, in youth adolescence policy. It happens everywhere. You need to be very effective when you do advocacy. Otherwise, you're just venting out, sharing your experiences, magically thinking that things or people will align with your thinking and things will change. You need to go to the decision maker and with solid argument and establish that conversation and knock on that specific door in the right time, and not hoping for a solution to be, showed or appear magically, but addressing that particular, maybe it's a very small bottleneck, but by doing that, you'll be unlocking the next door and so on until you reach your goal. So my advice is don't put yourself in a situation where you have a big goal and you just shout and shout and, hoping that that big goal will somehow realize. Go for the small bites and reach out to grandma. Look for the person that has the power to make that small decision. Might not be the minister, might be the assistant of the minister, just to get you an appointment with the minister. But make sure that you're doing it the right way. So that's how I think people will benefit from my experience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jan. So hearing you have everyone think a little bit about the importance of advocacy, how to get to grandma, and those small goals that you can get there. So thank you. So Alessandra, my question for you is, how has your understanding of the situation changed since it happened?
Thank you. And as I said, that was the very first, probably multi-year, multi-million project on inclusive sexual and reproductive health and rights. And throughout the years, many more came. And that lesson was very much learned. The key perspective that I kept is really that we need to find, we need to, first of all, at the beginning, very at the beginning, do this need assessment that not only on the focus of the project, sexual and reproductive health and rights, but on all the other aspects of the project when it's in link, especially with local organization and grassroots organizations. And so, as I said, it was a learning, very much a learning process. But what we saw, what I saw very much every day is I could see the challenges much earlier because I understood the aim was to understand how to translate the principle of meaningful participation into practice. And so day by day, week by week, year by year, I collected lessons learned and experiences that now are in a manual that is really called Inclusive Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights from Theory to Practice. And that was the evolution of a personal and professional journey that it really addressed how personally and professionally I saw the situation changing, but also made me discover the elements, the key elements beyond the focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And of course, I was able to move and transfer this knowledge from one country to another, adapting and contextualizing. And so I expanded. I started from one country where I was working primarily and expanded as I grew up in this career. Thank you.
Wonderful. So that's a big turnaround from your initial story, moving from that failure, but being able to translate it into a manual on from theory to practice and scaling it in multiple countries. So thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so we have heard some incredible stories and reflections, and I have a couple of broader questions for our panelists to spark some thinking about how we can embrace learning from failure. So my first question is, how do you suggest we normalize sharing failures? Bisrat, what do you think about that? Oh, can someone hand her a mic, please? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's not normalized to share failures, and I think I can share when I invited people to the session and said, like, what is the session on? I said, oh, failures. They were like, huh, what are you going to talk about? How can you say you failed in this? But I think sharing failures is really important, and it reminds me of a scenario that when I was back home in Ethiopia, and we were also like presenting like posters, and it was a program on FGM, and on that program it was a failure that we presented. It was more of like, we did this, we did that, but then nothing changed. Like the behavioral didn't change, FGM was still happening in that region. And I remember people were walking and asking like, why would you post this? Like, how is this important? But a couple of people came and asked, wow, this is really interesting. We are actually implementing things on FGM, and we now know what you are doing is not working. So we will avoid doing that, and people will learn from it. So it's not just that we are learning from our failures, it's also people will learn from our failures. So when you share your failure, like the other person shouldn't go through the same experience to learn that it doesn't work. We can just share it. And I think normalizing sharing failures in these kind of scenarios and settings of panels and even papers could really be like, what didn't work, what does work, and what doesn't work should be normalized. And failure should not be tabooed or saying like, oh, you're like, you shouldn't work anymore, but it's more of like, what should you do to avoid or like make it better? And yeah, it's being open about sharing your failures and letting other people learn from you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Bisrat. So my next question is what can we all do, those of us on the panel today, to set an example? Any thoughts on that, Abak?
I think even as we plan to succeed, we have to acknowledge that there is a chance we might fail. So that acknowledgement is quite critical for us. And when we do that, we would then not be very hard on ourselves when that failure comes. And we would be supportive of the people we work with when in case they fail. And we would be objective in trying to find solutions to the failures. So acknowledging that we all want to succeed, we all plan to succeed, but there is a chance failure could come, is quite critical and will help us all be able to manage failure differently. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Abak. And if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, the example we can say is as we're working with our teams and colleagues, we can normalize it. Yes, we all expect that this will succeed, but things may not, we may have a misstep and we can accept that and move on. Before I move on to the next questions, anything you would add, Taiwo?
Okay, so I just want to add that failure is a way of life. And at one point in time, we're all going to fail, and we need to acknowledge that. It doesn't make us failures. It just enables us to take a sit back and then just look at what we have done, as everybody has mentioned here, and course correct. How do we improve? And how do we use this as a lesson to others to show them that, yes, we can fail, but guess what? We pick up ourselves and then we move. I think that is very important for us to acknowledge as human beings that it would happen sometimes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Taiwo. So my next question is, what advice do you have for others about the importance of improving through sharing our failures? Alessandra, any thoughts on that?
First of all, keep sharing. Be brave and keep sharing, even if you feel that you're dying inside. But specifically, in link with my experience as a pioneer in this sector of inclusive sexual and reproductive health and rights, I want to call really for all those organizations and individuals who are now committing to the inclusion to really to value the experience of those who started earlier, because it is very easy to repeat the same, to fall in the same trap. And because lack of experience or lack of technical skills may be still there, despite the time has changed. And really, the recommendation is to keep in mind that if we want to really do well, we need to build on other people's failure in this case and on the experiences, and to start from the very beginning to set the scene in an inclusive way. Because if that is not done, there is no way to recuperate, or it's very difficult to recuperate. And then specifically for donors who are investing, of course, that is extremely important that they hear us and what we have learned throughout this journey, but also to remember that we are always called to work on localization, we are always called to work on sustainability, but then we need to have the chance to really work hand in hand with the organizations on the ground that do the work, especially women-led organizations. And to do that, we need the funds to build and to strengthen the capacity, or to give them the opportunity to build the space for themselves. And so let's not just stop on the focus of the sector that we are trying to promote. And if the money doesn't come in, all of us should just try anyway. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Alessandra. And how about you, Jan? What advice do you have for others about the importance of improving through sharing our failures?
Yeah, you know, I think failure is a very stigmatized word. and it's usually associated with weakness, dishonor, shame. Mistakenly, I can see that, you know, from people I know that have been really successful in what they do, is that the only thing they have in common is that they failed a lot, and they'll learn from that failure. So my advice would be to have that, to try to adopt that type of mindset, you know. Failure is the best way to learn, if you're able to recognize that you failed. But in order to do that, you need to recognize that you fail. And that was my most important lesson. I didn't recognize that. I was just failing and failing and failing on the same topic. Never stopped and thinking like, why am I failing? It was just, yeah, I partially succeeded, I call it. Because, you know, there comes with, you know, especially in the context you are, it comes with that, you know, shame, like, oh, I'm not the best. Maybe I can lose my job, or perhaps, you know, you're not recognized as well as by your peers. But I think it's extremely, you know, courageous and honest to recognize that, you know, I failed, so what? I'm moving forward. So that's I think tells a lot about, you know, who you are, and actually people, without telling them like how this, how important this is, they really see and appreciate that from you. So that's advice. Recognize when you fail.
Yes, that's actually a very key point, is to recognize when you fail. And I like the point that you made, that failure is the best way to learn. So thank you so much for that. So I have a couple other closing remarks, but I do want to thank our panelists, and I'm going to move on to my few closing points that I would like to make. Okay. So before we leave, I wanted to make space for talking about how we can share failures moving forward. So today, we had the wonderful opportunity to come together as a panel to share our failures. And so this is something that anyone can do in the future, and I'm happy to share that in upcoming SBC Summit, there's going to be a format about sharing about failures. So it's something that is becoming normalized and becoming part of conference panels. Another approach that people can use is fail fests, and many people may have heard of these before. They're fun, they're often outside of work hours, sometimes there's food and drinks involved, but it's a way for people to come together and share those failures in a very casual setting. Other ways in which we can talk about failures is in some small group settings. So participants can share failures in like small interactive groups, and this can happen internally within your organization, or you can do it externally and learn with other organizations. The one thing about the small group format is that it really fosters an environment of trust, and you can really dig deep into conversations. Other ways in which you can share failures, and this probably sounds familiar for many people, is after action reviews. So after an event or an activity, teams can come together to reflect on what went well or what didn't go well, and then capture these lessons learned for continuous learning. Similar to after action reviews, we have midterm reviews. So these occur, and I'm sure many people do these already, during implementation. It allows your team an opportunity to course correct and share insights while the work is in progress and fresh. So these are just a few techniques that provide ways to continuously normalize and destigmatize sharing failures, which is something we've heard about today. So before we go, I wanted to share a few practical resources if this is something that you'd like to dig into. First, we have our knowledge management training package, which has a learning from failure module. So it's a tool that's designed to help teams reflect on and learn from their missteps. It has PowerPoint presentations, exercises, etc. I had mentioned the NGO Fail Forward, so I encourage you to check out their website. It's a great platform that can help either individuals or organizations learn from failure in a constructive way. So as we wrap up, I hope that these stories have resonated with you. More importantly, I hope you leave inspired to share not only what is working for you, but what is not working. When we're candid about our challenges, we create space to grow and learn and improve together. So before we leave, I want to give a heartfelt thanks to our panelists. Please give them a round of applause. We so appreciate your openness and generosity in sharing your stories today. Takes a lot of courage to get up on a stage and talk about failure. So I think you've really all helped us see how failure is something we can learn from, grow from, and even embrace moving forward. I did want to give a shout out to my colleague, Sarah Mazursky, who's basically been my co-moderator behind the scenes. So thank you, Sarah. And as the conference continues, I really want to encourage you to share at least one failure, an experience with another participant, because you never know, you might benefit from your story and you might learn something in return. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.